Hi, I'm Caterina Fake. I am an investor at ESVC and the host of a podcast named Ingenious. My guest here today is Andrey Liscovich, who is from the Ukraine Defense Fund. What they do is they supply, they source and supply and distribute supplies for civilian fighters on the front line in the war in Ukraine. This is everything from energy bars to socks, to vehicles, to phones, and beyond. And I'm very happy to welcome him. He comes from a background in technology and in startups and has used all of his learnings from his earlier career in his new work. So welcome. I would love for you to tell us a little bit about your making the journey here. You were born and raised in Zaporizhzhia, and you came from there to join us today. So tell us a little bit about coming here and how that works.
What happened in between me
Yes.
growing up in Zaporizhzhia? Well,
Yes.
I was born in Ukraine, grew up there, finished high school, and then after that went to Moscow to do my undergrad in physics and then master's, and then after that went to the US to do my PhD. After my PhD, I went to Silicon Valley and stayed there. So I've lived in San Francisco since 2015. And then when the war started, I went back on February 27th and joined the effort to assist the defense forces. Most of our work today is focused on helping Ukraine get technologically advanced aid from the West, either through private funding or through transactions that are paid for by allied governments, which is now the majority of our work. We facilitated fairly significant number of these transactions, and overall, I would value the total amount of aid that has been delivered to Ukraine at almost $100 million. So this is the effort that involved Germany, US, Poland, various other governments, and we continue to work on that full time.
And the other thing too is that you're obviously a male between the ages of 18 and 60, which, as we know, are not permitted to leave the country. Under what circumstances are you able to leave, and what do you have to do in order to get out of the country?
Yes, Ukraine has universal draft, and people between 18 and 60, males, cannot leave unless there is a specific need. Every time you leave, you need to apply, and the main permitted criteria have to do with the efforts that are involved in delivering aid. So this is the fifth time I'm leaving the country during the war, and the previous trips I used for brokering or directly purchasing aid for Ukraine and returning with it. And this time is no different. After this forum, I'm going to a number of vendors in Europe that make equipment, drones, anti-drone equipment, and satellite imagery, and also going to the US for various policy discussions in DC. And so that effort is very much in line with the mission of the fund and is very much aligned with Ukraine's need to defend itself. So the government has decided to grant me permission to leave on this specific occasion. I have to come back within 30 days.
Okay, so it's not a long time away. Would you kind of tell us a little bit about when you were working in Silicon Valley and there were rumblings about the war, and what was your awareness of it at the beginning, and how did you come to the decision that you were going to actually leave Silicon Valley, leave your job, and help in the war effort?
Yes, as you remember, there was significant run-up to the war. The first time there was a major escalation was almost a year before the war actually started, when Russia deployed troops to the border and nothing happened, and many people thought this will be a pattern, where Putin uses the escalation in force to force the governments in the West to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO and committing to that in writing. Apparently there's been a number of these attempts, and so people have stopped believing that, and the Ukrainian government generally projected a lot of optimism and did not believe that the war would start, at least publicly. At least that was the messaging in the press. I also didn't think the war was very likely, but at the same time, whenever you're dealing with these asymmetric situations where the downside could be infinite, you want to be prepared on the off chance that it might occur. And I spent almost the entire month of February in Russia. I went there on purpose, having lived there for 6 years and having developed a lot of friendships with people through college years. I wanted to see them, and I knew if the war were to start, I would not be able to go back. And I also wanted to gauge the atmosphere, whether they themselves thought that the war was likely. And my impression was that they did not believe it was likely. The Russians in Moscow and elsewhere, I went to the Caucasus, they didn't seem to believe that the war was anything but a bluff and an attempt to strong-arm the West into some commitments that they didn't want to make otherwise. And so I went there and came back on February 21st, so right 3 days before the war started. And then the war starts, and my decision to leave had to do with the fact that the Ukrainian government chose to stay. Zelensky personally had displayed significant personal courage and took personal risks. The fact that he decided to stay and key government officials stayed and didn't panic and didn't leave gave me hope that there was a chance to do something about it and not be a passive spectator, but try to affect the outcome. And so I went there, entered the country on February 27th, on the third day of the war, and went to the front, trying to conscript, and was told not to do so by the conscription office because they were not short on people, but they were very short on supplies. And since then, I've been working on helping supply the defenders who are actively fighting this invasion.
When you went there, had you expected that you would see battle, that you would actually be a fighter?
I thought it was a distinct possibility, and I've since been at the front a number of times, but not as a fighter. I've gone there to test the equipment that we were bringing in. We only work with non-lethal equipment. We don't touch anything that it blows up, no weapons, no ammo. But we work on a lot of commercial non-lethal equipment that aids with finding targets, with correcting fire, with various other secondary functions that are very critical for the performance of lethal assets. And so I've been to the front a number of times, and I've seen fighting, and I've been under shelling repeatedly, but I have not been a fighter. Did I expect this when I was coming in? I thought it was very much possible. And I wasn't trying to take reckless risks, but there are situations in life when relatively few people, when they're at the right place at the right time, can make a significant difference, and I thought that was one of those situations.
Well, how were you? I'm trying to picture the interview situation in which you're arriving. You're a volunteer. You're a civilian, and you go through probably a battery of questions where they're trying to figure out where to put you and what you can be used for. How was that? How did that work out? What was the process there?
Well, the process was nowhere near as structured as you just
just
played.
Yeah.
I walked in, a person who knew me just told the head of the conscription office who I was. He looked at, again, my background and said, okay, we need supplies. It's like it was a
instantaneous, okay.
Like they had a line of people outside trying to get in. Like they were not short on people.
Right.
Very clearly. But they were very much unable to give these people anything but a rifle and 2 magazines of ammo. And so they were desperately short on everything else, and they wanted me to use all the resources I had available or could raise to buy this equipment and give it to the soldiers. And so they gave me a military convoy, and I spent the next 2 weeks driving around the city with just my personal credit card, buying tactical gear at military surplus stores. And it was still possible to pay with Apple Pay with your phone and get this done. And for the first 2 weeks, there was some inventory in the city, and we were able to buy it and immediately hand it over to these folks who were immediately being deployed to the front. And I don't know whether it played any role, but the fact is the Russian forces approached the city in the first week, and they never got farther north. So they stayed where they arrived in Vasilivka, 25 miles south of the city, and they were never able to get farther up. And maybe some of it had to do with these folks who were going there with some of the equipment we were providing in the very early days. So I feel there's a chance that these efforts were helpful, and we will never know. Again, the alternative history is hard to simulate, but I think it was important to be there at the time and didn't do this work.
But how would that mandate work when they say, okay, you, Andrey, are in supplies. You're on supplies detail, and then go.
Yeah, that's exactly
Is that all that they said?
Yes.
They didn't give you any instructions. They didn't
They
tell
gave me
you
a guy.
where to shop.
They did tell me where to shop. So one of these guys who was with me, he was driving with me, and he was literally pointing me, okay, here's the military surplus store. Here's what we need. They grab a pile of this. We check it out. Everything gets scanned individually. It was an infuriating effort to take time to check things out.
Earlier, Andrey showed me a photograph. It was actually really remarkable. It was attention Kmart shoppers. It was a mass of equipment. It was piles of gloves. Can you describe what that was like?
Well, imagine you walk into a clothing store and start grabbing things off the shelves. I mean, there have been scenes like this in San Francisco, but again, here it's for military purposes. Like, you need to quickly outfit a large group of people, and so they grab things off the shelves. But unlike in San Francisco, they had to go through checkout, and so we had to ring through every single item, and that process often took an hour because there's so many items. And what was surprising to me was that the army was not commandeering these assets. You would imagine in a circumstance like that, in the war, where they were expecting Russian forces within hours in the city, they would just grab whatever was there and would use it.
And but you could just walk through the door.
Yeah, and they could. They actually had
with the mandate to do so.
They had legal authority to do that, and they didn't exercise it. And
yes.
In hindsight, it ended up being the right decision, because these store owners were able to then replenish their inventory with the money that we paid them. And the real unsung heroes of this war are, besides the troops, of course, but these folks who worked in commercial supply chains that were the most effective infrastructure in the country. So logistics, retail, groceries. In Zaporizhia, there was not a single day when grocery stores were closed since the beginning of the war. I mean, that's a remarkable statement. There were periods when there were challenges with getting drivers to agree to drive in the city with food. But still, they were able to get things in. And so if you had the money, you could just go to the grocery store and buy food at all times. There was not one day without food, except for days when there was curfew in the entire city. But when the city was open, you could go and buy food. And so that was done by commercial supply chains. And the same thing worked in procurement for non-lethal gear. And so while there was inventory to get in Ukraine, they were able to use that capital, those funds that we paid for these types of equipment, to replenish their stocks. It was incredibly effective.
You know, I was recently reading an account by Dave Eggers, who was one of the writers who was brought in by PEN America to visit Kiev. And I read an article that he had written for The Believer about his experience there. And one of the things that really stood out to me was how normal everything seemed. How it was basically in Kiev, so long as you were not on the front or in one of the cities that had been, shelled mercilessly, it was very much life as usual. And that is as you describe.
It is very different when you approach the front, when you get into the artillery range, or if you go to a city that was previously occupied and has been liberated since then. Those cities have sustained very significant damage infrastructure-wise, that you will see real change. But in other cities that are a little bit deeper into the rear, including Zaporizhia, which is close to the front but was never occupied, life is quite normal. What's not normal is air raid alarms that occur often, but people now ignore them. They take them as background noise, and they generally ignore them. And one of the signs that life is quite normal is the fact that you would have a hard time getting into a restaurant without a reservation. And last Thursday, I had to walk through 4 restaurants before I finally got a place to sit at 7 p.m. on a Thursday, not even a weekend. And it's no different in Kiev. So I would encourage folks to visit. Coming to Ukraine and seeing it for yourself is worth more than reading any account from somebody else. And it's quite safe.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I actually find truly amazing. So here's one of the things that I think really stands out to me about your story is that, so you grew up in Zaporizhia and hadn't been back for 20 years, or you hadn't lived there for 20 years.
Well, I visited my parents.
And you had visited your parents, and yet you felt called to return. Why?
That's hard to explain rationally. This is something you feel deep inside you, and it's not something you feel always. There are moments in time when it emerges, and I wouldn't necessarily predict that I would have done the same thing a month prior to doing this. But the circumstances were really grim, and I knew that I was in a fairly unique position to broker between the West, between Western supplies and Western funders, these aid transactions that a lot of the folks on the ground would simply not be able to do because they would lack these connections. So I thought it was very important to leverage my Silicon Valley network, both among the donors and among the people who made the equipment that was useful for the defense effort. I thought I could make some difference in whatever small way I was able to, and it would be very difficult for the locals to do the same thing. And my parents live there. I know that they would not want to leave, and I would certainly hate to see my hometown be occupied, and that would completely upend their lives. So my parents and my brother are in Zaporizhia, and it's essential that the city remains under Ukrainian control. And my objective for the first month was to every morning look out of the window and see whether the Ukrainian flag was still flying over the main administrative building. That was our OKR in startup speak. So objective and key result: have the Ukrainian flag over the admin building by April 1st, and then by May 1st, and then by June 1st. We kept extending it. So I felt it was a combination of my ability to do something useful and my allegiance to my family, and I mean the fact that I grew up there, and I'm still a Ukrainian citizen as well as a U.S. citizen, and I felt it was incredibly important to try to do something while it was still possible to do.
One of the things I was very struck by was how similar the skills that you learned when you were, you were CEO of UberWorks, and a lot of what you were doing there was in some ways very similar to what you're doing now. Can you describe your prior work at UberWorks?
At Uber, I started a division that focused on offering drivers other types of work through the same app, so they could make money in between the morning rush and the evening rush, the morning commute and the evening commute. As you know, Uber has very peaky demand, driving people to work and from work, but in the middle, the drivers are relatively unneeded, and so they churn from the platform because they don't make enough. And one of the obvious ideas is to find the types of work that they would be qualified for and similar pay range, which is a staffing space and kind of day labor space. I had no background in that space, and so when we launched the business, I had to learn a lot about the lives of the day laborers and people who operate in that industry and what's important there, what's not important. And you have to execute this loop where you are working very closely with the end user and you try to learn their problems, but don't rely on their own view of what the solution should be, because they'll always have a very biased view of what the right solution. You can take them into account, but you cannot take them as gospel. And what you do next is that you try to offer them that you think is better, which may not be, but they would be the judge. And so ultimately, they end up judging what you're offering. And so executing this loop is essential for any startup that's trying to find product market fit. And what I knew when I was going to Ukraine is that I would have to find problems that I could somehow address myself with the help of my network and my resources, my connections. And we were executing this loop with a team. We started something called Ukraine Defense Fund, which is a US-based 501c3 nonprofit, with a group of Uber early employees who also operated in fairly adversarial environments in many countries. As you know, driver cars were put on fire in many countries. Some executives were jailed. Uber always faced adversity. And so these folks were in some way primed to help in these emergency situations. And we were constantly looking for, okay, what specific need can we fill at the lowest cost? How can we maximize the use of donor dollars, and how can we expand the donor base? And so that loop was, in terms of daily work, was not much different than running a startup within Uber in a different city, like in Chicago. But the fundamentals were very similar.
And you had originally started off in San Francisco at Uber, and then you had to open up, different territories. So it was very similar in
Yes.
some ways, because you were just dropped into a territory unknown to you.
Yes, Uber, as you remember, had lots of labor issues around driver classification, and because UberWorks classified workers as W-2 hourly workers, not as contractors, it conflicted with the core Uber model. So we had to stay away as far from HQ as we could to not create this perception of inconsistent classification. And so we ended up working first in LA, then in Chicago, and then we launched Miami and Dallas. And we never launched San Francisco, in fact. So we always were parachuted into the new area and tried to kickstart a business. So I'm used to living out of a hotel and kind of traveling for business nonstop.
So describe a typical day in your life now. I know that, for example, today you were fielding a bunch of information and sorting it. And tell me about what you were doing.
What I'm doing depends on where I am at the time. So I'm spending about 2/3 of my time in Ukraine. And of that, most of the time I spend in Zaporizhia, close to the front, and the rest of the time in Kiev, working with the general staff. Through this war, I started out not having any connections to the military, but over the past year I've developed some familiarity with the chain of command, and I now know folks at all the levels, from the very low levels to the commander-in-chief staff. And what we do now is we are trying to help them identify key non-lethal needs and then find the right solutions that exist in the West that could fill that need, and then find the source of funding, usually government funding, to cover that need. And so brokering these transactions is a primary MO. And the reason why we're focusing on government-based, government-funded transactions is because they have much larger scale and they have deeper pockets than a lot of the private donors. Although private donors tend to assume that if they spend a small fraction of what the government spends, they would not matter, their impact would not matter. And in my experience, private dollars go way farther than government dollars. Vendors tend to massively inflate prices when the buyer is government, and there's a way to buy. And my view would be that in terms of benefit from speed and lower prices, a private dollar goes probably 10 times farther than a government dollar. And for us, of course, the first priority is maximizing the overall aid provided to Ukraine. So whenever private capital is constrained, we are working with Western governments to pay for these and identify the right technologies that fit the need.
Well, this has been one of the things that your work has really highlighted for me, is that there was this idea that there was, things that were specifically made for the military, and then there were things that were made for consumers, and that those things were very different, and they were of different quality and type. But can you tell us a little bit about how you work with that division, and whether or not you think that what we're calling it, what we call it is dual use, is a category that...
there's obviously a spectrum, where on the one end of the spectrum you would have things like tanks, howitzers, ammo, clear lethal items. They're made by and large by a handful of defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, BAE Systems, these big players. And when you deploy these assets on the battlefield, for them to be effective, they're doing the firing, but in order to fire, you need to find the target. And if you miss the target, you need to adjust your settings and then try again and execute this loop until you're successful or until you run out of resources, ammo. And it turns out that the bespoke systems that are used for closing this loop are not always the most effective, or at least not the most effective per dollar. What Ukraine has done is use a lot of civilian technology that was developed for completely different applications and close this loop using civilian gear, because the West has not been providing, by and large, these non-lethal assets. The majority of aid has been lethal, at least from the US. And the way to think about this is, imagine you have an artillery system. The Soviet-era norm for how many rounds this system is supposed to use per single target is on the order of 60 shells. So you shoot 60 times, and then with sufficiently high probability, you think that the target has been eliminated. When you're able to observe where each individual round lands and then correct fire based on that, that number drops by an order of magnitude. And the question is, what's needed for that miraculous drop by an order of magnitude? And the thing is, it's not just the ammo that's saved. It's also the fact that the artillery is shooting for only 1/10 of the time. So it's exposed to the enemy counter-battery fire for a fraction of the time, and therefore both the system itself and the crew are much safer if they can do 5 shots and leave than if they have to do 60 shots and leave. And what makes it possible is a couple of guys in a pickup truck, like a beat-up Ford F-150, driving to the front with a Starlink in the back, plugged into a generator, with a tablet in their hands that has targets, and another guy would be flying a drone that they can buy at Best Buy or on Amazon, and they would be seeing where individual rounds land, and they would be putting it on a map, and they would also be talking to their artillery commander on WhatsApp, on an Android phone. They would literally be adjusting these things. Artillery runs on WhatsApp. Like, artillery strikes are often called on WhatsApp. So if you look at everything that's involved in this chain, it's completely civilian. It's not even dual use. It's something you can just go buy as a private citizen and use on your own. Normally they use for different purposes, but they close this loop that results in a miraculous increase in efficacy and reduction of risk. And so that's the underappreciated part of equipment that Ukraine needs but has not been receiving as part of military aid. It's clearly aiding the military. It's multiplying the effect of the lethal assets that have been scarce. But at the same time, it has a number of very compelling properties. If you look at the reasons why the lethal aid is constrained, and if you don't believe that it's constrained, just think about the fact that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is believed to have 12 brigades. It's a publicly circulated number from leaks. 12 brigades is 60,000 people, and Ukraine has 1 million people that are mobilized in some form. Why is it only 60,000 that are involved in the counteroffensive? And the answer is there's not enough equipment for them, for more than 60,000. And there are limits to increasing that aid that often are not monetary in nature. It's not just the money. If you had all the money in the world, you could not buy 1,000 HIMARS because you only make 90 of them per year. And even that's already doubled production pre-war. So there are supply chain problems that restrict military aid. There are red tape problems because when you're dealing with lethal assets, the regulation is fairly heavy on procurement itself and on deployment. And finally, there are political concerns about escalation risks. And when you look at the non-lethal assets that make the lethal assets way more effective, none of these apply. So it's a category that allows the West to saturate this need at a relatively low cost quickly without causing World War III and changing the battlefield dynamics in a macro way. So that's the big insight that we've extracted from this year and soon a half of this war. And this is the reason why the NGOs and the private citizens have been able to affect the outcome in such a significant way, because none of this is expert controlled. You can go buy it yourself. And these types of needs have been provided and filled by the NGOs and the soldiers themselves who pool their salaries to pay for them. And if these were military bespoke systems that were expert controlled, they would not be able to do this.
And you were also saying that something like, 20 or 30% of the soldiers' salary is actually goes back into equipping themselves.
Yeah, and at some companies, it's more than 50%. So what happens is they literally pitch in on payday. They pull parts of their salaries into a shared account, and then they use it to pay for various needs that this company has. And a lot of those needs have to do with vehicles, with energy, like generators. They buy their own gas very often. They buy their own vehicles, they buy drones, they buy Starlinks, they buy radios, they buy all of this equipment. And our goal is to try to scale that so we don't have to rely on individual soldiers using their paycheck, but we think it's possible to systematically supply the entire front with these needs.
This is the thing that I find so ingenious about what you have done, is that you have just, upended all of these assumptions about military requirements, and you are equipping a military basically using Amazon.com.
Well, it's certainly not me. It's maybe Ukraine at large, and I would say it's part of a macro trend that has been occurring. If you look at the history of dissemination of technology, a lot of it was imported from the military sphere into the civilian sphere. It was commercialized. GPS, the internet, various other technologies.
Yes.
We're now facing a very different reality where the private sector is spending 4 times more than the DoD on research and development. And we're now in a world where you can be certain that none of the defense contractors are going to make a better iPhone. They're not going to make a better Starlink. They're not going to make a better many things. And so the question is, how do we now leverage the things that are being built for civilian applications in a different context that allows them to enhance the capabilities that various militaries have. And so it's a big macro trend of which Ukraine has just become a poster boy, but it's not, it would have happened regardless. Ukraine accelerated these trends. The fact that Starlink has become the most important non-lethal product in Ukraine is, a happenstance outcome that might not have happened in an alternative reality. But Ukraine now has tens of thousands, if not over 100,000 terminals. At some point, it was consuming 1/3 of all European traffic. So it's now a major use case for this, and Western players can now see the impact of this, and of course they'll be learning and adapting their own kill chains This is the gruesome word for, again, this loop that the military executes at all times. So it's a big macro trend where Ukraine is a lab, and it actually affects the DoD in other theaters already today, because a lot of the weapons that were considered miracle weapons a year ago are no longer as effective because of the countermeasures.
Which ones were they? They were...
Well, if you remember, HIMARS was considered a complete game changer, and in fact it was, because it gave Ukraine a way of hitting targets way behind the front line very accurately. Mm-hmm. And now HIMARS is systematically jammed. The GPS is jammed, which means that the missile doesn't know, the rocket doesn't know exactly where it's flying. Mm-hmm. It can use cruder mechanisms for determining its trajectory, but then it misses by hundreds of meters, and that completely diminishes its value.
Okay, so it's being jammed by...
HIMARS, it's getting jammed by electronic warfare means, so GPS is getting jammed. That's what results in this.
Okay, so Russian military has somehow figured this out. After how long of a period?
They started doing this in November. So prior to November, they were only jamming some of the GPS frequencies, but not all, and now they extended it to complete coverage, and so now it's a serious problem.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that all HIMARS launches are subject to this, but whenever there's a jammer, a set of jammers deployed along the trajectory, this becomes a big problem.
Yeah.
Bayraktars, you remember those famous videos of Turkish drones flying over columns of armored vehicles and just destroying them. That has not been happening in a long time because anti-aircraft systems now easily destroy Bayraktars. So it's no longer cost effective. If you look at javelins that cost $200,000 each, and there were children named after them. There were cafes named after them. I think there's a national holiday of some sort, St. Javelin's Day or something. And,
wow.
Well, javelins, while they are still effective, but they're no longer cost effective because they're now FPV drones that cost $800 and in many cases can achieve the same result for less than 1% of the cost. And so Ukraine is now accelerating this arms race on these originally fringe technologies that affect the West everywhere, not just in Ukraine. And this is why Ukraine has a much broader set of implications than what happens at that front for Western allies. And I think it's very important for the West to consider heavily investing in commercial non-lethal tech because it closes the kill chain, and also learn how to disrupt the Russian efforts doing that. Because again, it's always, you try to optimize your kill chain and you try to disrupt the enemy kill chain. Jam whatever you can jam, interfere with whatever you can interfere. And so those two things are happening in parallel, and they're all evolving at a very rapid pace. And in order to be a step ahead of the enemy, you need to be in Ukraine, testing it and iterating on it.
Okay, so what I would really like to know is how can everybody, all of us included, support you, and what does need to be done, and be specific. What do we do?
Well, so if you start from the first principles, like in order to run this kill chain, you need a way of identifying targets, which usually means sensors, and you need a way of delivering those targets, which means you need to have some delivery vehicle, either a drone, a rover, a mast, whatever, a satellite. Then you need to communicate that to the command in some form, and then you need to relay that to the artillery system. And so when you look at the equipment involved, there are 4 big classes. Transportation, like that's the basics, because you need to get to the position where you're launching these drones and carry cargo. It's portable energy, because often you're in the field for a long time, you need to recharge batteries, and so this is significant.
Generators.
Third category is comms equipment. This is Starlinks first and foremost, but besides that, radios, two-way radios and mesh radios, data links. So that's a big category, and that also includes consumer electronics like laptops, tablets that are needed in large quantities too. Phones less so, because everyone has their own phone, just from civilian life, but laptops and tablets for sure. And then the largest category is intelligence, counterintelligence, and electronic warfare. And that means those sensors, delivery platforms, and software around them. And that also includes night vision goggles and different kinds of optics. Okay. So when you look at this set of categories, many people have thought, okay, let me buy some of those. Like, let me buy a little care package and send it to Ukraine. It is helpful, but it's not the most effective use of effort and resources. the most effective use of resources is to buy them in bulk and negotiate better prices and standardize the nomenclature. So you don't have what they call a zoo, like the Noah's Ark of every different piece of equipment that loosely fits the requirements. So the best thing to do is to, if you are not in the space that manufactures these, the best way to do is literally to donate funds or to help respective governments make these decisions through political pressure or through voicing those opinions. So it's making the funds available for these problems. The remarkable thing about this entire class of products is that this is just a money problem. Mm-hmm. You can simply buy them and you can ship them. Logistics is figured out. Logistics is very easy. You don't need export controls. You just need money to buy them. So the obvious thing to do for most people is to donate money to the funds that do this.
And where do people go to do that?
They can go to ukrainedefensefund.org and just there's a variety of ways to donate, either with credit card or with Venmo, PayPal, and larger contributions from DAF funds and IRA accounts. So that's the most direct way to do this, and more indirect way is to work with elected representatives, just keep them aware that it's important to continue supporting Ukraine on that front, and maybe emphasizing to them that non-lethal commercial aid is an important category that needs to be earmarked.
Do you feel that there is a bit of, you had described at one point how you were greeted with such enthusiasm as you were crossing the border back into Ukraine, and how you felt you were supported by all of the people along the way. Do you feel that this support is somehow diminishing, or people just have a bit of exhaustion?
Fatigue. Yes,
fatigue.
The word fatigue has been used more than once today when I had conversations with various folks at this forum. Yes, there's certainly inevitable fatigue. It's very hard to keep your attention on one subject for so many months in a row. So inevitably it falls into the background. The question is there a way to make sure that the folks who execute this process, like the DoD, the State Department, are properly resourced to do their jobs even when it fades from the headlines? And so this requires that even if people are not paying too much attention, they at least periodically check in and see where things are going. I would try not to, the common thing that people are doing, they're trying to forecast, okay, what's going to happen? And I think it's not the most productive way of looking at this problem. I think the most productive way of looking at this is asking, what can I do to change the outcome, rather than what this outcome is going to be for me as a passive observer. There's a famous quote from Alan Kay from the 70s that's very popular in the Valley. The best way to predict the future is to invent it. And it's very much emphasizing the agency of individual people. And individual people have created enough pressure on various Western governments who are very reluctant to provide lethal aid to Ukraine to start doing this and start to ramp it up. And just continuing that is incredibly important, even if I'm not saying it's important to read the news. I actually don't read the news myself. I feel like reading the news endlessly and checking in on every twist and turn of the counteroffensive, it doesn't do much because it's passive observation. It's not something that affects any of my actions. So to the extent to which it's important to my actions, I try to stay aware of the main developments, but I'm not reading every update on what happened to this brigade or that brigade today versus yesterday. So yes, there's fatigue, but it's incredibly important to not let Russia change borders in Europe by force and create precedent that may drastically affect borders elsewhere in the world, including in the Asian theater. So it's something that is incredibly important outside of Ukraine for people who believe in rules-based order. And I think it comes at a sufficiently low cost to continue doing this. If you estimate how much an average US citizen paid for military aid to Ukraine, of which Ukraine has already received 27 billion, actually received, there's more planned, but already received 27 billion. That means it's about $5 per person per month.
Each American.
Yes, each American. So it's obviously a large in absolute terms, a large sum, but a lot of it came from inventory that the DoD was planning on writing off because it was nearing end of life, older equipment. and it has also created jobs for the folks who are building the replacement equipment. So in many ways, it increases U.S.'s own defense readiness. It enables it to learn how to enhance its defense posture in Asia, in other theaters where current weaponry may become obsolete. And it comes at a sufficiently low cost to continue doing this. And my view is that it will generate a very important return in averting future conflicts if this effort is successful.
And would you be able to tell me what has been the worst part of your experience so far, and what has been the best?
The best part of my experience has been those two victories that Ukraine had last year. So the Kharkiv counteroffensive and the Kherson counteroffensive. I wasn't too exuberant. I try not to go through these roller coasters because every time you accept the high, then you have to accept the low and have to internalize it, and you become an emotional train wreck. So I try to be as subdued as I can when good things happen, and also equally as subdued when bad things happen. But I still realize that some things are like worth marking, and there were two big events last year that were very important. The negative events, there were many of them. Again, many negative developments in the front where people that become injured or killed. This is very hard to abstract away from. And when you see damage to civilian buildings, like destruction, it's emotionally difficult. But again, we have to postpone those emotions to after we've done our work. And so we need to focus on the work of changing the outcome and preventing that destruction from continuing.
So really, you see a time, and you were also describing how when you were approaching Ukraine, when you were coming to Ukraine, and before you had actually been assigned this detail of acquiring the supplies, that was actually some of the worst times.
Yes, so
For you.
that has to do with the same dynamic. When you're a passive observer and something horrible is happening that you cannot affect, that's the worst feeling in the world. You're helpless and something atrocious is being done to you or to the people you love and can't do anything about it. And so the first few days of the war, before I arrived in Ukraine, I was reading this news feed incessantly, and it was one terrible thing after another, and you just keep looking, and the map is getting colored with the red areas.
Airstrikes, yeah.
And it's increasing and increasing. It just looks worse and worse by the day. And in San Francisco, I went to a rally on, I think, the first or second day of the war, near the city hall, and of course they said all the right things, and I felt like, well, it's good, but it's not going to do anything to Putin's resolve to continue this invasion. So it was important for me to put myself out of the position of a passive observer and in a position of somebody who could, at least in whatever minuscule way, try to affect the outcome.
Well, I wanted to thank you so much for coming here and talking to us about this, and I really hope that those of you who are in the audience and who are listening online will help in the war effort and with the support of the Ukraine Defense Fund and of Andrey's work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.